Hello, guys. David Vos here. What a beautiful day it is here on the Red Mesa in New Mexico, here in Candy Kitchen. It's definitely a beautiful day, a beautiful hot day. I don't think I've felt this kind of sweltering humidity since, I don't know, maybe back east when I went to Alabama. And I don't mean the second time, but in the southern part of Alabama, down there where it's near Florida and stuff, where it's just so humid. And I'm sure it's much worse there. I mean, it's been a long time, and I've forgotten the suffering that people go through in the South. But because here it's only about 85 degrees at the highest, and it probably isn't as humid as there. But boy, it's been here in the desert. It's been really hot and humid. Well, I hope you're having a wonderful day. And I'm not really complaining because I've really enjoyed the rain and the garden and everything and green. But I was sitting here minding my own business again, like I always am. And there was a lady. I don't need to play it for you, but I like her. She's always doing conspiracy TikToks and so forth. She's into the pyramids and so forth. Johanna James, that's her name. She's very interesting. I haven't watched her enough to know what she really believes. She really believes in Jesus or anything, but she's interested in the Bible, history, the pyramids and things, and she has a lot of interesting things. The problem with a lot of these people is that they think that all of the past has been ignorance. We didn't know anything. That poor Newton, right? And Francis Bacon. They were just ignorant fools. It took Einstein and Darwin, the geniuses, to figure out that there was just a big bang and there was no deity and, So they don't know, or they don't realize. I mean, while at the same time, they're declaring that the ancient ones had more knowledge than we do. They understood everything. They knew about the stars and the ley lines, and maybe they had technology. And so they're always talking about, Tartarian things. But yet they still approach reality from the premise that modern science and what they've been told somehow has a bearing on reality. Because now I'm not talking about Johanna James. She's probably a wonderful, brilliant lady. I all I'm mentioned her for is because she had a video where she was talking about the Stonehenge. And it's interesting because we were just talking about Stonehenge, and so I was listening real quickly when I hear a TikTok or something. And maybe they'll have some facts for me or something to throw in there that I didn't know. And there was something. She said that there was discovered at Stonehenge some burial sites that the investigators are claiming that the Stonehenge isn't just an astronomical clock or a calendar, rocks that line up with the stars, but that they might serve a mechanical use. That the stones were set up in such a way that they would resonate, that the stones themselves would resonate. And there are certain kinds of stones, granite and basalt or whatever, different kinds, and limestone or something. And the way they set it up is that these stones would resonate at specific nodes, almost like an octagonal perimeter with octagonal nodes. And the node would be where the resonance was the deepest at these octagonal points. And this frequency that was going out of these rocks was just below the ability to hear it. So you wouldn't hear the noise or the frequency or the vibration. You wouldn't hear it. It'd be below the ear capability. But it would be a very deep emotional recognition, that the humans would be aware of it, that it might tune their soul in some way. But what's interesting is that at each of these nodes, where this resonance was deeper, there was a grave. And she said there must have been more than one person that was buried. I think she said something like 60 or 53 or so. I don't know how many were buried there that they found. I'm sure they haven't found them all. Maybe they have. I don't know. But I think she said, and this might not be exactly right, but I think she said there were 14 of them that they found that were at these particular nodes around the Stonehenge at these frequency points. And that each and every one of them were Welsh, from Wales. And immediately I thought, well, the Welsh is the lineage of King David, because we talked about that the other day, that the Plantagenet line from Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ that was in the Languedoc, they fled in the Inquisition, the Waldensian, Albigensian Inquisition. They fled. They went, first of all, folk of this Plantagenet line went to the Palestine area. Because remember, Jerusalem's real, because from the time of the apostles, there was a Jerusalem there. And these circumcised Jews did have a Jerusalem there. And so it's a place, and it's not far from where John the Baptist, his tomb is, and Mount Carmel, and where Elijah was and had the school of the prophets. So, and we talked about how you could draw a line from John the Baptist's tomb right around Mount Carmel, where the school of the prophets was, and go directly across the ocean or the Mediterranean and cross Britain or England, and it would go right over Stonehenge, and we showed you that, and it would then go all the way over to Marietta, Ohio, and you keep going from there, and it goes all the way to Teotihuacan, or the Temple of Del Sol, the sun, Mexico City. And there's so much I want to get off. I want to veer off right now into some other stuff, but I got to keep it to where we're at here. So, this place in Marietta, Ohio is a cemetery, which, by the way, is spelled with a C. If you spell it with an S, it's symmetry. And at every cemetery, there is symmetry. That's what it's all about. It's interesting that it's not even the same. They claim that the roots of these words are different, and so they're not related. But it's odd that so many of these words come down from different roots and yet seem to have some esoteric deepness to them. But anyway, so in this story, the Plantagenet line from Fulk's son, Geoffrey, and Geoffrey had a daughter named Joanne, and Joanne Plantagenet they took her to England, and she married into the Welsh line, Lynwilder or something, Cadwelder, the Cadwelder line or something, which had documented history going back to King David. And then King James, and later on individuals that came through that line, and Francis Bacon, had historical proofs that they were of the King Arthur line, which is also the king line of King David. So when she said that these bodies that were buried there were Welsh, and also it struck a note because, remember, we started off at a cemetery where John was buried. We cross the ocean to Ohio, where there's a cemetery. And in the middle, there's a Stonehenge, but now we know it's also a cemetery. And they always say, oh, they're not cemeteries. They're not tombs. The Great Pyramid's not a tomb. Well, yeah, it's an empty tomb. Osiris was raised from the dead. But, it was actually a monument. In fact, that's what monuments are. Obelisks, monuments, even to this day. People put obelisks as monuments to people who die. Joseph Smith has an obelisk on his grave. Ellen White of the Seventh-day Adventists, the prophet of the Seventh-day Adventists, has an obelisk on her grave. Jehovah's Witnesses, Charles Taze Russell, has a pyramid, which is kind of like an obelisk, on his grave as a marker. It's a tombstone, is what we call it today, but it's a tomb marker. And that then is what the pyramids were. They were built, each and every one of them, for one of the gods. And by the way, the home of the gods, or where the gods were born, do you know where the gods were born? Teotihuacan, or Mexico City, the Temple del Sol, is, that word Teotihuacan means where the deities were born. And so Joseph Smith said Adam and Enoch and these pre-flood individuals were in America. That's where the Garden of Eden was. Isn't that interesting? Now, the Temple del Sol, Teotihuacan, that we see there today was built about 100 BC. And, of course, Enoch, the real Enoch, and Adam lived thousands of years ago. So it's not the same construction, but it's based and built on the original spot where thousands of years ago Adam and Enoch lived in America. So it was a holy place, and these Templars and people who came years after, and the Nephites or whoever, they knew these holy places, and they were, by divine providence, taught to rebuild these ancient holy places. So that is a holy place, one of probably the most holy place of all, and all the ley lines that for either side of the good side or the bad side, when they make their ley lines and they draw straight lines and all the cities are in a line, and all of them go straight to Teotihuacan in Mexico City. And that would be the holiest area of all, maybe the holiest site where Enoch's temple was built, but it could be anywhere here in the Rocky Mountains, or Mount Zion, where the original Mount Zion was, north of there. The Aztlan, which is the Atlantis people, and the Tenochtic land, or the land of Enoch, because T's were silent, so it's Enoch land. Why are they named this? Well, it turns out that Enochic land and Teotihuacan, which is Teo Enoch, Teo is Theo, or God, right? Just like in the Greeks, they have a D, or a dia, before the last part of the word, like Dionysius, which is the deity of Isa. In Hebrew, it's El Isa, or Elisha. And here we have Teotihuacan. The T is silent, so it's Enochian. It's Enoch, you see. And it's interesting because we know that the prophet Joseph Smith said that, Eden was here in America around the Gulf. And all the way around the Gulf, and the whole of America and Mexico and Venezuela and Cuba and all of this was Eden. And the heart of it's missing now, or something, or sunk. That's where Atlantis sunk. So the Nephites came over in 600 BC and they built Mexico City. Well, they came up in about 200 AD, and they came up north from Mexico City, up through Mexico and over into what we call the United States, and they met another group of people, the Molochites, which also came over in 600 BC. And so the Molochites were the people that we call the Hopewell, that were building all these astrological ley line cities and cemeteries. And they met up with the Nephites that were being expelled because they were having fights and wars with the Lamanites and so forth. And they ended up coming into the United States. And then they had their last battle in New York, and you've heard all that. So I was looking at the fact that they have these cemeteries, and that Stonehenge now I see is a cemetery. And also that the people that are buried there are Welsh. So they're not, because I was thinking, they said that originally that Stonehenge was built 3000 BC. Sometimes they say 2500. Oh, well, give or take a few hundred years. Who knows, right? That carbon dating. But anyway, that's about when Nimrod was alive. Now that's interesting because Nimrod was beheaded just like John. And Nimrod is the beginning of this Trinity, Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz. And the Bible talks about they're weeping for Tammuz because Tammuz died, right? That's Christ who went down into the hell for 3 days and came out. And then he comes out and he resurrects his father, just like Jesus resurrects Lazarus. So the Egyptian story is Osiris and Isis. The Babylonian story is Nimrod and Semiramis and Tammuz. And there's always a bad guy too. In the Egyptians, it's Set. In the Greeks, it's Saturn or Saturn. And the good guy's Zeus. The Bible is based on all this because we've got the story of the two brothers. One kills the other and all of this in the Bible. We also have the story of the virgin birth, Christ, his 12 disciples conquering death, and the raising up of his father Lazarus, and the temples, and the ceremonies, and Enoch, which is the Bible way of saying Thoth, or the Greek Hermes, or the Latin Mercury. And so the Hermetic studies is the study of Enoch. But I was going to tell you, do you know then where the deities were born? Well, that's the word Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan is the city of Enoch. So Joseph Smith said that Adam was in America and Enoch built the city, which would have been, we don't know because there is no city. Well, it would have to be at least, like 10,000 years old if it was built by Enoch. Like the Great Pyramid, which was probably either built by Enoch or somebody else because Enoch got in a boat and went over to the Middle East area too and built that city. And that was always called, the Great Pyramid was called the Temple or the Pillar of Enoch. But, so Adam was in America, but Enoch was, of course, with his dad, 7 generations from Adam. And just before the flood occurred, Adam went to the Middle East and was buried at the Great Pyramid, at this great big city that Enoch built in Egypt. But before that, he probably had a shrine or a temple, Del Sol, the city of the sun, Ra, the original city of Atlantis. These others are copies. Even Heliopolis was a copy on the Nile. Now, the Temple del Sol, Teotihuacan, I'm not saying it was built before the flood. It wasn't. It was built about 100 BC or something like that, from 100 to 200 AD. Interestingly enough, it was built just about the same time, a little before, but about the same time. About 180, they started building 100, 200, 300 AD. That's when they were building these mounds and stuff in Northern America. So it fits perfectly with the Book of Mormon, which says that the Nephites were down there building in Mexico, were run out through Mexico up into America, went to Iowa, Ohio area, where Zarahemla was, and then combined their building talents and their nation with the Molochites, who were also of the lineage of David, King David, of the Melchizedek, or the Molochites, Melech meaning king. And they came from Jerusalem, 600 BC at the same time. So both of these individuals came here for a providential reason, by divine providence, to build and create society and temples and teach the world the reason we're here. It wasn't haphazard. We were placed here. This divine arrangement was a school, a classroom. They gave us temples. We learned the ways. We got married. We had funerals. We were taught why we're here, why we live, why we're born, why we get married, to bring forth children, to have babies, to give them bodies, and then to ascend into a higher classroom. All of this was just taught us. The Lord reigned. Now, it's only been in the last, because even the Catholics taught a lot of this for the first few hundred years. It's been apostate for a long time. But maybe the last 1,500 years, or give or take, there's been this apostasy, so the world doesn't really know why we're here anymore, and we're still doing a lot of the rituals and the ceremonies, but we don't know why. And this is why, and this is what we're going to get to here today, about how science has rejected the old paradigms for no reason. They were logical, scientific, and they were absolute axioms. What Newton and before Francis Bacon, but before that, Plato and Pythagoras, they were priests. Pythagoras was a priest. And they believed, not like modern scientists, which just accept some ridiculous theorems, and they start with trying to figure out geometry by saying, well, we don't know what point A is. We don't know the angle. We're not going to worry about the distance between A and B, but we're going to tell you how far C is from B and what, kind of an angle. In other words, they're using this rationalism and philosophy to come up with the model of the universe, theorems. But the ancient truth started with a clear fact. The universe is a whole, we know that. That's a fact. Only a whole can be divided into axioms and variables. Nothing could not produce something. And therefore, a material, unconscious matter cannot evolve from nothing and then somehow evolve into intelligence. The reality is that we are here. This universe is here. It is designed. It is perfect. And therefore it came from design, from mind. And the only then empirical evidence is that the universe was manifested by a divine mind. But they've thrown all that out. So over there in Mexico, you draw the line from John the Baptist's tomb. You go through Stonehenge, which is a cemetery. You go through Marietta, Ohio, which is another cemetery that the Sinclair from the Roslyn Chapel, which was the president of the Continental Congress, became the governor of the Northwest Territories, and took the Brotherhood, Delphia, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians. They went to Ohio. They did a ceremony, called it the Capitolium. And we're going to see why building a Capitolium is so important and integral to history and what's really going on, because the Capitolium, we get the word cap from the top of your head. That's why you get a cap to put on your head. So cap and decapitation is to cut your head off, and John the Baptist's head was cut off. The reason that the Bible or history tells you that his head was cut off is because he was the Grand Pupa, the head of the institute of the classroom, the school of the prophets. And that system, when he was beheaded, was eradicated. That was the reason for it. Same reason why Esau beheaded Nimrod. Because that ancient truth that was with Nimrod, this virgin birth and all these teachings were being eradicated. That's why they cut the head off. That's like what, you've probably heard, you cut the head of the snake off and then you don't have to worry about it, because you don't want to get bit. So to decapitate somebody, you're done. You got it. They're finished, even if they're a vampire. So Nimrod was killed by the enemy because they didn't want his ceremonies, his ritual, the classroom, the virgin birth, the resurrection, all these things to be taught. But it continued on anyway. And then it came down through the Greeks talk about Zeus, and the Sumerians talked about Osiris, and the temples were aligned with Orion, which is Osiris, and Isis, which is Sirius, the star, and the Pleiades, and so forth. We find that Mexico City is also aligned with the Pleiades. And it doesn't have a Nile. it has the San Juan River. And San Juan's not really big, it's a smaller stream, but they made these channels and straightened it out to mimic the patterns. And there were more than just one temple there. There's a lot of temples in Mexico, of course, but right there at that Del Sol, or the Teotihuacan, just south of it is the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, which is the Temple of Christ. And a little north of Teotihuacan, so here you have Mexico City, a little northeast is Quetzalcoatl, directly north a few miles is Teotihuacan, and a few miles directly north of that is the city of the moon. Well, that's also interesting because in Egypt, they also have these various temples to various things like the sun and the moon and stars. And it oriented and stuff to certain ley lines. But Helios is the sun. And north of Heliopolis, they have moon temples. And the moon has to do with Thoth. Thoth was the moon as well as his mother. So they called this, they straightened out the San Juan River. And that's a big job. I mean, these people used to move mountains, with whatever technology they had, and canals and hydraulic systems, like we talked about from Cambodia, that they found that city over there in 900 AD. All of them are around the same time, building the same pyramids and hydraulic systems and dams and pyramids. They got step pyramids in Mexico. They got step pyramids in China. But here's what's crazy. These step pyramids are a lot like, to me, they look a lot like ziggurats, but that was Babylon 2,000-3,000 BC. These step pyramids, even in the Amazon and Mexico, are only recent, in the last 1,000 years. But they're still doing the same pyramid. And science will say, or history will say, oh, they're different peoples. They came about it completely random and just different tribes wandering around. They all have the same beliefs, same deities, the same flood story, the same virgin birth, the same, all the funeral services and ceremonies about what happens to you when you die. Oh, but don't think that was trying to teach us anything real. It was just a bunch of confused aboriginals running around a fire going, hootsy, 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 ay, 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 ay. That's it. Don't worry about it. Trust your scientist. But, so Cambodia, you've got China, all over the world are these same temples, pyramids, ziggurats, all of them very similar, even though different. Like the ones in America were made out of mounds of earth. They claim, who knows, maybe they were there so long that the stones turned to dirt, or maybe if you dug down in the dirt, you'd find rocks or something. But, it would be different because different areas have different resources. So if they were going to build temples in Canada or Russia, they're going to use timber. And they would be more temporary. You could burn down or whatever. But if you're living in areas where it's desert, like Egypt, you're going to use stone. You're going to make cement. You're going to make quarry stones and so forth. So there's going to be differences. But the end result is straight lines, symmetry, astrology. And so Teotihuacan was the place where Enoch built the first city. Well, actually, the second city, because Cain's Enoch built a city. But remember, Cain was sent to the land of Nod to be a wanderer. So he built a city somewhere far away. But where that is, we're not going to get into today. But this is where the pre-flood individuals were born. You understand? The deities. The Ogdod, according to the Egyptians, or the 8, which is Noah and his 3 sons and their 3 wives, which is the 8, Noah and his wife. And then before the Ogdod was the Enneads, and the Enneads were the 9, and that would be the 9 individuals from Adam all the way down to Noah. You don't count Noah, the 10th, because he's part of the Ogdod. So anyway, the deities are the people that we have in Genesis chapter 1, Adam down to Noah. And even after that, Nimrod was one of the mighty hunters. It was Osiris. And it's part of these deities. So the deities go all the way down, pre-flood all the way beyond the flood, all the way down to the days of Abraham. And so they found these 15 bodies that were genetically, from their DNA, they claimed they were from whales. And so I'm thinking, all right, Stonehenge is also a grave. And all of these temples are graves or tombs. And they all believed in the funeral and the wedding. And this is not something that the Jews pay a whole lot of attention to. They're more interested in Passover and, the feast of, Pentecost, which was a wedding, by the way. The wedding of Israel to Yahweh was on Pentecost. And the wedding between the church and Christ is going to be on Pentecost. But there's two parts to it. There's the first part of the former rain, and then there's the latter rain that we're about to go through. But it happens at Pentecost, which represents the great wedding. So it is about a wedding, but the Jews have gotten rid of the woman. They don't rever her. She's not even allowed in the temple. She's made a permanent slave, Exodus 21:7. So that's the difference. The southern part of the kingdom of the world, the Torah and the carnal laws and the lower ego, is ruled over by the temple of Yahweh, which is vengeance and death. The rest of the nations, the 10 tribes, which were centered around Bethel or El, when they scattered around the world, they made their temples like Aphrodite and the temple of Artemis and the temple at Athens and the Eleusinian mysteries and so forth all around the world, Shinto and Buddhism and so forth. But these bodies that were buried there, and I looked on Google and asked AI when those bodies were supposed to have been there, if they carbon dated them. And they claimed that these individuals were genetically Welsh, and yet they were there from 2500 or 3000 BCE. So I was like, wait a minute. If Nimrod built Babel, Akkad, Sumer, and parts of Egypt, a lot of the pyramids he built, he was the mighty hunter, and he was building civilization and sending forth Abraham to go to Canaan and sending, different peoples around the world. He was the priesthood holder. Could he have gone to England? Because who would have gone there? Well, it would have had to have been either Nimrod himself or he sent people there. But they built this Stonehenge, which is another grave. Well, who are buried at this grave? Well, there are 15 bodies, genetically Welsh. Who are the Welsh, the descendants of King David? But David was 1000 BC. This was built before David. This was built in the time of Nimrod. So who was buried there? Well, if you're going to go back to Nimrod, Nimrod was the son of Cush. And Cush was the son of Ham. So, that doesn't mean anything because Cush was in Ethiopia. But somebody who had the same priesthood, and we just don't know exactly who. I'm going to investigate that more as we go along. But somebody connected with this early time about Nimrod went there and built this cemetery. But since it's in a direct line from John the Baptist's tomb all the way across to where Israelites built a capital in America, and it's in a direct line to Mexico City where Adam and Enoch was originally, I think Stonehenge has to be a site or a grave of some specific group of people and a specific deity. If it goes back 3000 BC, it's probably somebody right after the flood, maybe Abraham or Nimrod or somebody's tomb. So, I'm curious about the Welsh genetics there. It's up near the Welsh. I mean, that's where they were. So it's no mystery that they'd be Welsh, right? But this is 3000 BC, long before the Welsh story, because even King David's only 1000. And if they were descendants of King David, they went there after King David. So that's only several hundred BC. This is, whoever was there were Welsh, but they were there I don't know how they know they were Welsh, but maybe they have the same DNA as the Welsh that are there now. I don't know. But they have the same DNA. I think most everybody has the same DNA. We're all Israelites, in my opinion. But these Welsh married into the Plantagenet line because, as we said, King James claimed heritage from King David and Arthur. And then Francis Bacon and the Rosicrucians believed this completely and fully. And it was part of what they called this theological narrative that they believed goes all the way back to Enoch. But Joan Plantagenet, she was also known as Siwan. She was the daughter of King John of England. In 1205, she married Lilwyn the Great, Lilwyn ap Lorworth, who was the prince of Gwynedd. Lilwyn's family, the house of Aberfraw, traced their lineage back to the Rhodri the Great, who was the older legendary Brythonic king. And in the medieval Welsh traditions that they believed in, they believed that the princes of their line were associated with the prophecies of the legends of King Arthur, and specifically King James VI of Scotland, when he became king, which is King James I, 1603, he had some genealogists study all of this, and they reviewed history, The Kings of Britain, which is written by Geoffrey Monmouth, and they claimed that the British monarchs descended from King Arthur and Brutus of Troy. Now, Troy, you know, we've all heard of that. That's where a lot of people say Troy was inhabited by some Jews that were the Tuatha De Danann, or the tribe of Dan. Now, Dan, remember, married Delilah, who was a Syrian from Sidon or Tyre. So Dan went to Greece and started the line that ended up being Alexander the Great and the lineal descent down to Julius Caesar. And they call him Hercules. That's our Samson, the strong man. So Troy was a story about Israelites. And all these stories are about Israelites all over the world. So James I, King James I, believed in the divine right of the kings. And they linked the Scottish Stuart line to King David. And they said that King James was a new David, destined to unite the kingdom of Britain. Francis Bacon served as King James' Lord Chancellor. They were cousins. And he was into this Renaissance tradition, esoteric philosophy, Christian mysticism, and that was what they called science in those days. And it was more scientific than science today. It was based on facts, and they teach us things that are wrong today. It's all upside down. We don't know or understand history because we have these little misconceptions in our mind to think that ancient ones used nonsense to believe what they believed, and that religion is nonsense. But today we're going about science. Well, that's not it. What people believed in those days was more scientific than what we believe now. And based on traditions of history, based on traditions, we're told. But what is a tradition? It was handed down from priests. And priests had to have facts for what they believed. They carefully transcribed or copied ancient historical things, chiseled into stone. They weren't making it up like people today are, like we think. So the Rosicrucian movement was about that time. Bacon was a Rosicrucian. So people in Britain in those days, they're scientists, they're alchemists, the people who believed in the ancient wisdom, they believed that Britain was chosen by deity. And now you can see why. Like, wait a minute, I thought that Israel was chosen by deity. Why they got the British that think they're chosen now? Because they believed they were Israelites. You see, it's just not some theory by Herbert W. Armstrong in the last 21st century. No, this is something that was believed and was taught and was verified by thousands of years of scientists, but we've discarded it all now. So they approached the whole idea of what is true from history and from the ancient ones and from the knowledge that they were given and handed down through the priesthood. And they were initiated and carefully preserving these traditions. It was symbolism, sacred geometry, divine providence. They believed that Britain was chosen by deity to lead a global, intellectual, spiritual reformation in the world, and it was verifiable genetic genealogy and history. Now, you see, this has to be legitimate, all of this stuff that they believed. But even if it wasn't, the 16th century explorers, the esoteric teachers, the scientists of that time believed it. They based their travels to Ohio on it. Sinclair, possibly related to the Rosslyn Chapel and the Stuart line, the Merovingian line of the Fisher Kings. So Sinclair, the president of the Continental Congress and the governor of the Northwest Territories, along with the Brotherhood or the Delphia Brotherhood that was all Freemasons, there with the blessings of Washington, they built the Capitolium and called it the Capitol on a cemetery in Ohio, built about 100, 200 CE. And they had the line, or the ley line, and the other lines that go through Boston, New York, Philadelphia. And so they had this ley line going from John the Baptist's tomb, across Stonehenge, all the way through Ohio and over into Mexico City. But then there is the other line that we talked about that goes through Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Mobile, Alabama. And it also ends up in Mexico City. But that can be traced back not to John the Baptist's tomb, but it can be traced back to Paris, France, where the Illuminati set up the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, infiltrated the Freemasons, and put in their spy, Benjamin Franklin and Voltaire. They came over like as spies while they were doing the Constitution, but they couldn't stop it. So we know then that the line starts where this group would start. So the other group was the people that believed in John the Baptist and Nimrod and Christianity. The other group that started in Paris was a secret Illuminati pretending to be Christian, but they weren't. They were Satanists. So the ancient ones, like Pythagoras and Plato and these guys, they believed in what they called the Prisca Theologia. That meant, it's a Latin phrase that meant ancient theology. And that ancient theology is the concept of a single, true, universal theology was given by deity to humanity in the deep past before the flood, and it was handed down and passed down through history via the chain of ancient prophets and sages. Deity revealed the ultimate secrets of the universe, mathematics, spirituality, to the very first humans. But it was handed down from somebody, from Hermes, down to Noah, because he was the one that survived the flood. And then Noah gave it to Ham, and that ended up in Nimrod's hands. Esau stole it, beheaded Nimrod. Jacob tricked Esau, bought it for a bowl of red soup. And then Jacob had it. And then it went to Moses and Zoroaster, Hermes, Pythagoras, and Plato, and eventually came to Jesus Christ. You see, it got from the Jews to the Persians, basically, for two different reasons. It was about that time that Israel was taken captive up into the area of Assyria and Persia. And so not only was the people then literally most of them were Israelites, but and all these kings, like the book of Isaiah says that Cyrus, he's my anointed one. Well, Cyrus wasn't an Assyrian, he was an Israelite. Osiris, or the Tsar, or the Zerah of the line of Judah. So not only were the people pretty much Israel there, but the priesthood of the Magi, Mithraism, which is Zoroastrianism, which is what Daniel was the head or grandpapa of, the religion of the world. Daniel was like Elijah, but before him, he was the grandpapa of this great pagan, the nations, the 10 tribes Israel. They worship El at the house of El. Daniel was the head of the Magi. And the entire world was broken up into 3 regions, and they were given to 3 Israelites, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So Daniel was the head of the Magi, not only of Persia, but also of Media, and later in Babylon. For quite some time, he was Zoroaster. So that's what the obvious truth must be, because it's not only verifiable, we got their works, all their books, what they said, what they claimed. The father of history, Herodotus, tells us the same story. Josephus, the father of history from the Jewish point of view, tells us the same stories. And this is then contrasted with what people believe today. The scientists of today, the ignorant fools, so people like Newton, because this is after the apostasy. Newton was in 1500 AD. That's when they were trying to remember all this ancient truth, because remember, there had already been an apostasy. They burned the Alexandrian libraries down. They destroyed temples, and everything was destroyed, so they didn't know the truth anymore. They put out the flame. They got rid of the Vestal virgins and the eunuchs and the temples, and burned it all down, outlawed it. So this scholar from Florence, Italy, Ficino, was hired by Cosimo di Medici to translate these Greek texts, which they brought from Egypt, and they brought it there, and they asked him to translate it and to decode it. The text was attributed to the Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus. Ficino translated them and argued that Hermes predicted the coming of Christ, and that pagan philosophy perfectly mirrored Christian truth. So Giovanni Pico della Mirandolo, which you talked about the other day, which was a student of this Ficino Pico, he kept studying this, expanded this Prisca Theologia to include the Jewish Kabbalah, which I don't agree with, which was brought in from the bad guys, the Babylonian Talmud guys, because they were trying to offset the Gnostic spiritual mysticism with this Kabbalist, this Jewish Metatron that denied Christ, but was similar to the mysticism of the true Christians, but was twisted and was really Satanism. So he argued that it was all the same thing. It was Jewish mysticism, Egyptian magic. They call it, they always got to throw in the words like magic. They call it Greek philosophy. And they don't realize that philosophy is not what we think of it today as something inferior to logic. It's just philosophy. You're just making it up. No, phileo is love, and Sophia is wisdom. And the love of wisdom, you see, is the love of the Holy Spirit. That's what the Holy Spirit is our Mother Sophia. And she will teach us all things we need to know in the hour we need to know it. So, the early scientists, they were scientists in that time, Francis Bacon and Sir Isaac Newton. They were influenced by this Prisca Theologia. Newton actually wrote millions of words on alchemy, biblical prophecy, and ancient chronology. He believed that the ancients understood all of this stuff like gravity and the structure of the solar system, and he was just rediscovering it. So these secret societies believed, they didn't just assume, they had this information handed down through the priesthood, through the Knights of St. John. So it's not speculation. They were preserving a sacred text and a sacred knowledge. They believed they were the modern keepers of the golden chain, as they called it. And they believed that the Masonic lore honors figures like Nimrod, the master of the sacred architecture, because of this divine geometry. So, esoteric thinkers like the Freemasons and Arthur St. Clair, when they went to Ohio, found these massive geometrically perfect earthworks. And they didn't say, oh, these are crazy pagan things, but they believed they had found the Prisca Theologia that had been there and that was handed down through the priesthood of other peoples years before them. So they didn't just believe, but they had empirical knowledge that science and geometry and astronomy was a precise science. They then traveled across the oceans to the Americas, and they knew then that these same individuals with the same priesthood had already traveled to America long before Columbus. So it would make sense that they would revere Nimrod, because he seems to be the guy, the original person that had this Semiramis and their son Tammuz, the beginning of the tradition of the Trinity, the virgin birth. Nimrod or Marduk or Osiris or Zeus, that every nation on the face of the earth traces all of their history to. This Nimrod, the mighty hunter, which is Osiris, Orion, Zeus, was beheaded by Esau, and this is a lot like Osiris, who was cut up by Set. So Isis bore Horus, and Horus raised Osiris from the dead. It's exactly like Jesus and Lazarus. And the odd thing is that the Knights of St. John revered the skull of John. And not only was John beheaded, and his skull in all the Mary Magdalene paintings, but Nimrod, Marduk, Osiris, 3000 BCE, was also beheaded. And, my question would be, if Nimrod built Akkad and Babel and other ziggurats, it is said to have built the pyramids in Egypt, not the Great Pyramid, of course, because that was built before the flood, but Enoch, Thoth, Hermes, Mercury handed down the knowledge to Noah, gave it to Ham, Ham gave it to Cush, Cush gave it to Nimrod, Nimrod gave it to Esau, Esau gave it to Jacob, and then this goes then to Elijah, who wore the tunic of hair, the sacred garment of Adam, the mantle that fell on Elisha, from Elijah fell on Elisha. Elisha is the one who raised the widow's son, just like Elijah raised the widow's son, just like Jesus raised the widow of Nain, or Anna, Nain, Anna, different languages. And this was in Syria. This is where Elisha went, up into Syria. This was Galilee of the nations, or the circuit of the nations, where Jesus went, near Mount Carmel, the school of the prophets, and it's where the Baptist body was buried. And the head may have been the place of the skull, or Golgotha, the word we use for capital. And Sinclair was building the Capitolium in Marietta, Ohio, at another cemetery, built in 200 AD or so. So if you continue the line past Marietta, Ohio, that ley line, it goes right through Tenochtitlan, or Azatlan, Teotihuacan, the city of the sun, where Adam's son Enoch built the city. And this is the place where the deities were born, Teotihuacan, an earlier altar that was there before whoever built the present Del Sol Temple of the Sun that's there now. What we've done is synthesize the mythologies, the history, the geography, and outlined perfectly the exact structural blueprint that the 17th and the 18th century esoteric organizations like the Rosicrucians, the Knights Templar, used to understand the development of the world. So I believe it's impossible to believe that all these peoples arrived at this architecture, this astrology, symmetry, and cemeteries, pyramid structures, all independently. The priesthood was of Enoch, and wherever it went, it retold the same story. The deities with the same stories. They're all definitely connected. Since the Templars colonized, explorers were sent by kings of Europe, and Genghis Khan and Prester John and Joseph of Arimathea had to have built civilizations everywhere. They must have been driven by Israelites from Assyria and Dan and his ships that took their Mithraic religion, because they were in Assyria by Persia, and they were listening to Daniel, who was the head of the Magi. So after Jerusalem was destroyed, the religious capital was in Persia, and it was Zoroastrianism, Mithraism. And so those Israelites were into this Mithraism, and that's the same teachings of the Bible, just now it was in Persia. And they took this religion, which is basically an offshoot from Israel. We know that the Roman soldiers had these secret societies and guilds. They were Mithraic traditions. They were taught how to build the mounds. They built the mounds in Europe. The Roman soldiers that were Mithraic, that were of this Mithraic tradition, which is where we get most of the secret societies, all of them. They had guilds and secret initiations. They built the mounds in Europe. They built the mounds in America and in China. They built the cities and the cultures around the world by divine providence. They were sent. They had a priesthood. They had a mission. We can't explain it any other way. And Solomon was at Karnak. Amun-Ra, Solomon, the same word. It was the world power before Babylon took over in 600 BCE. Egypt was the world power. King David was king of the entire world. And after 600, Babylon became the beast system, and it's got many heads, and it comes all the way down to today. But science, they don't see any of this. They don't see the world. They don't see the world from the perspective that a universal priesthood built the whole thing. So what they're doing is they're not rejecting religious fanaticism like they claim, but they're rejecting the facts and the history. Herodotus and Josephus, Berosus and Plato all say this. It would be illogical to believe that all these civilizations had no connection, since everyone believed in the same deities and built the same temples. Herodotus, Josephus, Berosus, and Plato, they're not just minor footnotes in the Book of Life. They are the foundational pillars of classical history and philosophy. They explicitly write about deep, ancient connections, lost civilizations, and shared memories of the primordial past. And so when we point this specific stuff out, we're not just inventing theories or citing profound schools of historical thought that existed thousands of years ago but are stupid, but they're historical and factual. We're entirely correct by saying that ancient authors did not view the world as a series of isolated, random events. They wrote about deeply connected global history. Plato, around 400 BCE, in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, Plato explicitly says that the Egyptian priests at Sais held records of a cataclysmic history that stretched back 9,000 years before his time. It included the lost civilization of Atlantis, or the days of Noah, before the days of Noah. And he openly argued that the Greeks were like little children compared to the antiquity of the Egyptian priesthood that goes before the flood to Enoch. Herodotus, in about 450 BCE, said that, who is supposedly the father of history, he traveled extensively, and in his histories, he frequently details how the Greeks inherited their deities, their religious mysteries, and their geometry directly from the Egyptians. The land of Kemet, as we've just seen, the Greeks stole all of their knowledge about these deities from the Egyptians, according to the history books and everything. But I don't necessarily think that's true, because that would mean that all the nations of the earth stole all their knowledge from the Egyptians. But I don't think they all stole it. I think they just all believed the same things. The Sumerians had the same teachings as the Jews, as the Egyptians. But I do believe that the Egyptians was the oldest source of this knowledge, because the Great Pyramid is the true priesthood and goes back before the flood. So, if you look at the genealogy of Zeus, he goes back, according to the Greeks, to deities that were Egyptian deities. Cassiopeus, Ethiopia. In fact, Ethiopia was a Greek deity, a daughter of Zeus. And so all of these stories of Zeus and Ethiopus, Cassiopeus, Andromeda, Cephas, and all these Greek deities that brought about the Olympians and the Titans and all of this story is not just from Africa. It's from Ham, who happens to be African. But Ham goes back to Noah. So all the traditions of the world all goes back to Nimrod. Because remember, when Nimrod was alive, he was just a son of Noah, a son of Ham. At that point, there weren't all these different nations. They were all one nation. And they were all one nation when they were in Babylon or in Egypt. They all spoke one language. It wasn't until after Yahweh came in and scattered them all over the world that they all had different languages and nations. So, if they were all one people in Babylon and in Egypt, they weren't black and they weren't white. They were just the children of Adam. But from long centuries being in Africa, certain people that went that way ended up with darker skin. People that went to the North Pole ended up with very light skin. It's just genetics. It's just the survival of the fittest. It's just melanin. It has nothing to do with race. So the Greeks didn't inherit their deities from Africa. They're simply retelling the same stories about the priesthood from Egypt, like every other nation on the face of the earth. Josephus, who wrote up to 100 CE in his Antiquities of the Jews, he records the traditions of Enoch and Seth. He writes that Adam predicted the global destruction of water and fire, which was the flood and Sodom and Gomorrah. And by the way, that Sodom and Gomorrah that was all destroyed in fire was something that other nations had in their little repertoire of history. It was always a flood and a fire. In our Bibles, there's a flood and a fire. But Josephus said that Adam predicted the global destruction of water and fire, and to preserve their astronomical discoveries, the pre-flood patriarchs built two massive pillars, one of brick and one of stone. And then there was Berosus, who was a 3rd century BCE priest or historian. All the historians and anybody of any prominence, historian, mathematician, politician, whatever, they were all priests. So he was the priest of Bel Marduk. Berosus wrote in his book Babylonica that there was a half man, half fish being named Onius. Remember, that's On or John. So Onius is one of these deities. Is John, that's Noah, merged out of the water, just like Noah went through the water in a boat. And he taught humanity the secrets of letters and sciences and the arts and agriculture and geometry and all the things that supposedly we have. And he said that all civilization was given intact by the divine deities before the Great Flood. That's history. That is reality. But science today has completely dismissed all of it. But this modern mainstream view, scientific view of today, is violently and jealously opposed to the actual facts to create some false paradigm, some false atheistic paradigm. They cannot acknowledge the actual facts since it would reveal the Wilhelm Institute, Darwin, Einstein, Hegel, Nietzsche, Freud, Marx fraud. Rationalism is the effort to catalog the many lies into a workaround of Jesus and the Knights of St. John. It's patently ridiculous to think that all civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and centuries and systems variously arrived at, could all tell the same virgin birth story, the same deities on the mountain and a flood story, the same temple constructions, the same rites and ceremonies, the same moral disputes, and the same Hammurabi Moses government codes and civil and moral ethics, prisons, armies, altars. It's not possible. All because when they want to know the distance from C from B, they refuse to look at the angle of A and B, and they assume the distance is a coincidence. Darwin, Einstein, Darwin's biology, Einstein is physics, Marx, economics, Freud, psychology, Nietzsche, philosophy. They're not independent scientific breakthroughs. They're just coordinated, multi-pronged philosophical efforts to dismantle the ancient, divinely ordered history of the world and replace it with this worldview based on materialism and randomness. There is a law of probability that we can look at that would be against this independent multiplicity. If you look at human history as a single equation, the sheer number of identical variables across the completely isolated populations makes the mathematical probability of coincidence drop to actual zero. The repeating story of miraculous births, dying and rising solar deities, a divine mother, Isis, Horus, Semiramis, Tammuz, Mary, Jesus, over 200 distinct cultures across Asia, Europe and America, Africa, all have the same foundational myths about a catastrophic global deluge and a chosen family that survives in a vessel. The striking structural similarities between the Code of Hammurabi in Babylon, or the Mosaic Law in Sinai, or the ancient Egyptian mat, that also establishes an identical civil ethic system of justice, prisons, and altars. Every major civilization has built its highest temples as symbolic mountains, ziggurats, pyramids, Mesoamerica, teocallis, and they host the exact same rites and initiations. So if we assert that all of this happened by chance, it requires us to believe that human beings scattered across impassable oceans, separated by thousands of years, all independently hallucinated the exact same complex theological, architectural, legal blueprints. Logically, it is far more consistent to deduct that they're all looking at the exact same original point, an angle, point A. We note that as they argue that the human genome and the laws of physics are the ultimate baseline. Humans all share the same biology, the same brain structure. We all have the same exact physical constraints of nature. And our societies will inevitably then output the exact same structure with armies, laws, pyramids, flood myths. But it's just some kind of function of survival and psychology. That's what they believe. But that's ridiculous. It's just made up weird stuff to say that. My view, though, is that is a materialist explanation. It's mathematically absurd. It's a coping mechanism designed to hide a deeper truth. My argument says that the global consistency of human culture is absolute proof that a singular historical reality exists, that humanity shares a literal, physical, and spiritual origin point that was intentionally recorded by the ancient ones and carried to the ends of the earth. They're basically the world, they're using mesmerism. They state the obvious illogical suppositions and false equations into the discussion that the average person cannot know, that these are illogical, random, irrelevant points. In math, we don't use rationalism to philosophize the ultimate truth by saying that the ultimate fact that life is proves it always was. When we say that there is an ultimate fact that life is, and that proves it always was, it's a manifestation of mind, of deity. That's not even debatable. Basic math proves the world was manifested by a mind, not random occurrences. Since if reality came into being from deity, it is a miracle. But if it came into being because of unconscious matter, accidentally, through a big bang, where did the material come from? That would be a miracle of miracles, as Jesus said. Jesus confronts this very argument. There are no variables in zero. You cannot get something from nothing. So nothing evolved into something is illogical. The ancient scientists knew that only a whole can produce all the variables. The sexagesimal system is the language of the true intelligent scientists, and the modern Einsteinian cult followers are all mesmerized by some financial system that rewards a cover-up. If the world is, it is. And its design is inherent within it. It's logic. It's the word in the beginning, right? With deity. And without him, the word, nothing was made, or the plan. That is not a cult decree or a mindless assertion. It's the certain fact of science that modern science has abandoned. If you insist that facts or empirical truth cannot be used to understand reality, you're basing everything that you believe on a lie that truth was disproven, but it wasn't. And now we have to live with this constant search for truth that can never be ascertained, but can only be constantly maneuvered through subtle sleight-of-hand tricks to hold the public spellbound, because it is a satanic spell. And that is what I got to say about that. But I'm looking at the time. I'm way over, and Quacker the duck is all upset and wants me to go feed him. So I'm going to let you guys go. Hope you have a wonderful evening. You know the Lord loves you so very, very much. His grace and His peace will always be with you. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.